Jordan by Glyn Jones. Read by Huw Carr. Directed by Brenden James. I am worried. Today when I cut my chin with my white-handled razor, I didn't bleed. That was the way Danny's shaving went. Danny was my friend. Together we had worked a spell with the fairs and markets out there in that country where there was nothing but farms and chapels. It was a sort of uncivilized place. I had invented a good line, a special cube guaranteed to keep the flies off the meat, and Danny had his little round boxes of toothpaste. This toothpaste he scraped off a big lump of a sort of batter, a few pounds of it, greenish in colour and with a bad smell. It stood on a tin plate, and sometimes Danny would sell it as a corn cure. So as to gather a crowd round his trestle, he used to strip down to his black tights and walk about with a 56-pound solid iron weight hanging by a short strap from his teeth. This was to show what wonderful teeth you would have if you used Danny's toothpaste. It was only when he was doing this that you ever saw any colour in Danny's face. The colour came because he did the walking about upside down. He was on his hands doing it with his black stockings in the air. Danny was thin and undersized. If I made a joke about his skinny legs, he would lower his lids offended and say, "Don't be so personal." He was very touchy. His tights were combs dyed black, and they looked half empty, as though large slices had been cut off from inside of them. He had a fine, half-starved face, very thin and leathery like a sad cow. There was only one thing wrong with his face, and that was his ears. Danny's ears were big and yellow, and they stood out at right angles to his head. From the front, they looked as though they'd been screwed into his skull, and one had been screwed in a lot farther than the other. His straight carrot hair was very long and thick and brushed back over his head. When he scuffled about on his bandy arms with that half-hundredweight dangling from his teeth, his mop opened downwards off his scalp as though it were on a hinge and bumped along the cobblestones. He was very proud of his teeth. He thought so much of them, he never showed them to anyone. No one ever saw Danny grinning. My own line was that special cube I had invented to keep the flies off the meat. I used to soften down a few candles and shape the grease into dices with my fingers. Then I put 1 or 2 of these white dices on the cut of meat on my trestle in the middle of the market crowds. There were always plenty of fat flies and blue bottles buzzing around in those markets, what with the boiled sweet stalls and the horse droppings, but you never saw one perching on my meat when my white cubes were on it. This wasn't because the flies didn't like the candle grease, but because under the meat plate I had a saucer of paraffin oil. One night, Danny and I were sitting on the bed in our lodging house. The place was filthy and lousy, and we were catching bugs on our needles off the walls and roasting them to death one by one in the candle flame. Danny was bitter. The fair had finished, but the farmers had kept their hands on their halfpennies, and the weather was bad, very wet and gusty and cold all the time. Danny said we were pioneers. He said these farmers were savages. They didn't care about having filthy teeth or eating their food fly-blown. He was very downhearted. He hadn't had much to eat for a few days, and between the noisy bursting of the bugs, his empty belly crowed. I was downhearted too. We had to get money from somewhere to pay for our lodgings, and a seat in the horse brake drawing out of town the next morning. I asked Danny to come out into the town and see what we could pick up, but he wouldn't. At first he said he was cold. Then he said he'd got to darn his tights and his stockings. In the end, I went out by myself. The town had been newly wetted with another downpour, and Danny was right about the cold. As I walked up the dark, empty main street, I could feel the wind blowing into the holes in my boots. Everywhere was closed up and silent and deserted. I looked in at the Bell and the Feathers and the Glendower, but they were all empty. From the swing door of the Black Horse, I saw inside a big, broad-shouldered man sitting down by himself in the bar. Apart from him, the bar was deserted. He was by the fire, and his back was towards me. I knew bumming a drink out of him would be as easy as putting one hand in the other. I knew this because he had a red wig on, coming down over the collar of his coat, and a man who wears a wig is lonely. On the table in front of the man, I could see a glass of whiskey, and in his hand was a little black book. He was singing a hymn out of it in Welsh. It was sad, a funeral hymn, but very determined. I stood by the door of the empty bar and listened. The man seemed huge in the neck and across the shoulders, and every time he moved all the flesh on him seemed to begin to tremble. If he kept dead still, he stopped trembling. I went in past him and stood on the other side of the table by the fire. When I got round to the front of this man, something snapped like a carrot inside me. His face was hideous. The flesh of it looked as though it had been torn apart into ribbons and shoved back together again. Anyhow, back onto the bones. Long white scars ran glistening through the purple skin like ridges of gristle. Only his nose had escaped. This was huge and dark and full of holes. It curved out like a big lump of wood with worm in it. He was swarthy, as though he was sitting in a bar of shadow. I looked up to see if perhaps a roof beam had come between him and the hanging oil lamp lighting the bar. There wasn't a hair on him, no moustache or eyebrows, but his wig was like bright feathers of a red hen. It started a long way back, halfway up his scalp, and the grisly scars streamed down over his forehead and cheekbones from under it. He had a tidy black suit on and a good thick-soled boot with grease rubbed in. The other leg was what looked like a massive iron pipe blocked up at the end with a solid wooden plug. It came out onto the hearth from the turn-up of his trousers. It is best to tell a tale when you haven't got any cash to put it on the counter. When I began to talk to him by the fire, I tucked my feet under the settle and said I was a salesman. Although Danny and I could get all of our belongings into a tobacco box, I soon had a fine range of second-hand goods for sale. The man closed his little book to listen. He told me he was Jordan, male servant to the old doctor of the town. I took a polished piece of rabbit's backbone out of my coat pocket and passed it over to him. It looked like a small cow's skull, complete with horns. He examined it slowly, trembling all the time. He had huge, soft hands, and his fingernails were as green as grass. I told him he could keep it. He called for whiskey for the both of us. As I drank my whiskey, I enjoyed thinking what I had for sale. I had a little harmonium, portable, very good for Welsh hymns, perfect except for a rip in the bellows. A new invention that would get a cork out of a bottle like that. A nice line in leather purses, a free gift presented with each one, a brass watch key, number 8, or a row of glass-headed pins, a pair of soft leather knee boots, just the thing for him because they were both for the same leg. The man's eyes were small. They looked half closed up, and he watched me hard without moving them all the time. In the heat of the fire, a strong smell came off him. It was a damp, clinging smell, clammy, like the mule-jeweled corner of some old church, up there behind the organ where they kept the beer. At last he went forward and held his smashed face close to mine. I stopped talking. He trembled and said softly, "I am interested in buying only one thing." Somehow, I felt mesmerized. I couldn't say anything. I am not often like that. I lifted my eyebrows. Jordan didn't answer. His little eyes slid round the empty bar. Then he moved his lips into a single word that staggered me. I stared at him. For a minute by the blazing fire, I went cold as clay. He nodded his head and made the same mouthing of his smashed face as before. The word he shaped out was corpses. There was a dead silence between us. The clock in the bar echoed loudly like a long-legged horse trotting down an empty street. But I let my face go into a twist and I squeezed a tear out into the end of my eye. I crossed myself and offered the serving man the body of my brother. I had buried him, I remembered, a week ago come tomorrow. Jordan took his hat and stick out of the corner. The stick was heavy, with a lot of rope wound round it, and the black hat had a wide brim. When he stood up, he was like a giant rising above me. He was much bigger even than I had thought. He looked down hard at the little bone I had given him and then threw it on the back of the fire. He went out into the street. As we walked along, his iron leg bumped on the pavement and made a clicking noise like a carried bucket. He would show me where to bring the corpse, and I was to come between midnight and daybreak. We walked together out of the town into the country. It was pitch dark, and soon the way was through wet fields. It was still cold, but I didn't feel it anymore. Jordan had his peg leg, but he was big, and I sweated keeping up with him. He trembled all the time as we walked, but his shaking didn't make you think that he was weak. He was like a powerful machine going full force and making the whole throbbing engine house tremble to the foundations with its power. I trotted behind him, breathless. He was so busy singing the Welsh burial hymn that he didn't drop a word to me all the way. At last we came to a gate across the lane we were following. There was a farmhouse beyond it, all in darkness. Jordan stopped singing and shouted twice. There was no reply. He started singing again. He poised himself on his iron leg and his walking stick and gave the gate a great kick with his good foot. It fell flat. We found ourselves going at full speed across a farmyard. A heavy sheepdog ran out of the shadows, barking and showing a fringe of teeth. He looked huge and fierce, enough to tear us in pieces. Jordan didn't pause, and I kept close behind him. The dog charged his gallop into a stiff-legged prowl, and he filled his throat with a terrible snarl. Then suddenly he sprang straight at Jordan's throat. As he rose in the air, Jordan hit him a ringing crack on his head with the stick. He used both hands to bring it down. The dog dropped to the pebbles of the yard, passing a contented sigh. He didn't move again. Jordan put his good foot on him and brought the stick down on his head again and again. He went on doing this, his sad hymn getting louder and louder until the dog's brains came out. I went cold in my sweat to hear him. At last he wiped the handle of the stick in the grass of the hedge and went on down the lane singing. We came in sight of the lights of the big house. "That's the place," he said. "Bring it round the back door. Good night." He went off into the darkness like a giant in his broad-brimmed hat. I wiped the sweat off my head. After he had disappeared, I could hear his hymn and his leg clicking for a long time. His hymn was slow and sad, but it didn't make me unhappy at all. It frightened the life out of me. On the way back to town, I kicked the dead dog into the ditch. Danny never let his job slide off his back. As I climbed up the stairs of our lodging house, I came face to face with two eyes watching me through the upright bars of the top landing banister. It was Danny dawdling about on his hands, practicing. I had a lot of trouble persuading him to be a corpse. All he had to do was pretend to be dead and let me and the black man on the landing below carry him out to the doctor's house. Then, when we were paid and everybody in the house was asleep, he could get out by one of the downstairs windows. We would be waiting for him. We'd leave the town by the first break in the morning. It was safe as houses. Nothing could go wrong. At last, Danny agreed. At midnight, the three of us set out for Jordan's house. We were me, Danny, and Marky. Marky was a half-caste cheapjack, a long, thin, shiny man, the colour of gunmetal, selling fire-damaged remnants and bankrupt stock and that. He used to dribble and paw you at close quarters, but he would do anything you asked for him for twopence or threepence. We walked through the fields carrying a rolled-up sack and my trestle until we came in sight of the house Jordan had shown me. Danny stripped to his comms under a tree and hid his clothes. He put on an old cream flannel nightgown Marky had brought out of his stock. Then we sewed him in the sack and put him on the planks of my trestle. It was pitch dark and cold, with a small rain drizzling down again as fine as pepper. The doctor's house was all in darkness. We went round to the little pointed wooden door at the back of the garden. I whispered to Danny to ask if he was all right. There were 2 answers: Danny's teeth chattering and the uproar of dogs howling and barking inside the garden. I'd never thought about dogs. What were we going to do? At once, I heard the click of the leg the other side of the wall, and Jordan's voice speaking. "Down, Varro! Down, Angal!" he growled. The narrow pointed door was thrown open, and suddenly we saw Jordan. He was stripped naked to the half, and he had left off his wig. He looked so huge, so powerful and ugly in the doorway, with his swelling nose and his fleshy body all slashed. I almost let go of our load with fright. And behind him the hounds, 3 of them, black and shaggy, and big as ponies, yelped and barked and bayed and struggled to get past him to attack us. Jordan spoke sharply to them at last. We were able to carry Danny into the garden. He was as light on the boards as a bag of hay. Jordan spoke only to the dogs. He made a sign and led us bobbling along the pebble path across the yard towards some dark outhouses. The 3 hounds paced, whining beside us, sniffing all the time at the sack and spilling their dribble. The room we went into smelt like a stable. It was dim and empty, but there was an oil lamp hanging from a nail in a low beam. We laid Danny across some feed boxes under this lamp. Jordan stood back by the stable door with the whimpering dogs while we were doing it, watching us all the time. I could feel his eyes burning into my back. His skin was very dark, and his chest bulged up into big paps, resting above his powerful folded arms. But all his body was torn with terrible wounds like his face. Long, shining scars, like the glistening veins you see running through the rocks of a cliff face, spread in all directions over his flesh. His bald head had a large dome on it, and that was covered with scars too. His whole body gleamed down to his waist. The drizzle had given him a high shine, like the gloss of varnish. We left Danny lying on the boards across the feed boxes and came back up to the door to ask for our money. Jordan didn't reply. Instead, he took a large clasp knife out of the pocket in the front of his trousers and opened it. Then, ordering the dogs to stay, he went past us and bumped over to where Danny was lying in his sack. He seemed to take a long time to get there. There was dead silence. As he went from us, we could see a black hole in his back you could put your fist into. My skin prickled. Marky's eyes rolled with the dogs sniffing him, and he began to paw the air. I looked around and saw a hay fork with a stumpy leg in the corner. Jordan turned round under the lamp and looked back at us, The blade of the open knife trembled in his hand. He turned again and cut open the sewing in the sack above Danny's face. I could hardly breathe. Danny was so white under the hanging lamp, I thought he really was dead. My hair stirred. Danny's teeth showed shining in his open mouth, and in the lamplight falling right down upon them, the whites of his half-opened eyes glistened. He was pale and stiff, as if he had already begun to rot. Jordan bent over, gazing down at him with the knife in his hand, the lamp spreading a shine over the skin of his wet back. I was frightened, but if Danny's teeth chattered or his belly crowed, I was willing to use the pitchfork to get us out. At last, Jordan turned. He spoke for the first time. "He's a good corpse," he said. "He's my brother," I told him. "Where did you get him from?" "I dug him up." He nodded. He left the knife open on the feed box and came over to us. Putting his hand again into his front pocket, he brought out a large lump of wadding. This he opened, and in the middle lay 3 gold sovereigns. He passed the coins over to me with his huge, trembling hands and motioned us out roughly. He went back and blew out the oil lamp, and we left Danny alone there in the darkness. Jordan locked the stable door, and the hounds trotted round us growling as we left the garden through the little door. "Good night," said Jordan. "Good night, brother," I said. We walked about in the fields trying to keep warm, waiting for the time to go back and get Danny out. Marky had gone ice cold. I was worried, especially about those dogs. I wished I had a drop of drink inside of me. When we thought everything would be quiet again, we went back to see if it was safe to give Danny the whistle. I threw my coat over the bottle glass stuck on the top of the garden wall and climbed up. I could see a candle lit in a downstairs window of the doctor's house, and by its light Jordan moved about inside the room in his nightshirt and nightcap. Presently, his light disappeared, and all was in darkness. An owl in a tree close by started screeching. Marky was frightened and climbed up onto the garden wall to be near me. There was no sign of Jordan's dogs in the garden. It was bitterly cold up there on top of the wall without our coats on. The wind was lazy. It went right through us instead of going round. It had stopped raining again. There was a moon now, but it was small and a long way off, very high up in the sky, and shrunken enough to go into your cap. We waited a long time, shivering and afraid to talk. Marky's eyes were like glass marbles. At last I saw something moving in the shadows by the stable. My heart shot up hot into my throat. Marky caught hold of me, trembling like a leaf. A figure in white began to creep along the wall. It was Danny. He must have got out through one of the stable windows. I whistled softly to him, and at that there was an uproar. The 3 hounds came bounding across the yard from nowhere, making straight for Danny, baying and snarling like mad. I didn't know what to do for the moment with fright. The dogs were almost on top of him. Danny sprang onto his hands and began trotting towards them, his black legs waving in the air, and his nightshirt fell forward and hung down to the ground over his head. The dogs stopped dead when they saw him. Then they turned together and galloped away into the shadows, howling with fright. When Danny reached the wall, we grabbed him firmly by the ankles and pulled him up out of the garden at one pluck. We were not long getting back to our lodging house. The next morning we paid our landlord and the brake driver with one of the sovereigns we had had off Jordan. I didn't have any luck. All the rest of the summer it was still wet and there were hardly any flies. I tried selling elephant charms, very lucky, guaranteed, but the harvest failed, and in the end I couldn't even give them away. Danny got thinner and more quiet. He was like a rush. He had nothing to say. There never was much in his head except the roots of his hair. Having been a corpse was on his mind. And he was like a real corpse to sleep with, as cold as ice and all bones. He lost interest even in standing on his hands. We visited a lot of towns that held fairs, but without much luck. One market day we were sitting in a coffee tavern. It was a ramshackle place built of wooden planks, put up for the market day in a field behind the main street. The floor was only grass and the tables and benches stood on it. You could get a plate of peas and a cup of tea there cheap. Danny didn't care about food now, even when we had it. Because it was market day, this coffee tavern was crowded. It was very close inside, enough to make you faint, and the wasps were buzzing everywhere. All the people around us were jabbering Welsh and eating food out of newspapers. Presently, above the noise, I heard a bumping and clicking sound in the passage. I felt as though a bath full of icy water had been shot over me inside my clothes. I looked around, but there was no way to escape. Then I heard the funeral hymn. In a minute, Jordan was standing there in the entrance of the coffee tavern. He was huge, bigger than ever, a door full. In one hand was his roped-up stick, and in the other his black hymn book. His broad-brimmed hat was on his head, but instead of his wig, he had a yellow silk handkerchief under it, with the corners knotted. He stopped singing and stood in the doorway, looking round for an empty seat. A man from our table just then finished his peas and went out. Jordan saw the empty place and hobbled in. We couldn't escape him. He came clicking through the eating crowd like an earthquake and sat down at our table opposite us. At first I didn't know what to do. Danny had never seen Jordan and was staring down at his grease floating on his tea. I tried to go on leading the peas up to my mouth on my spoon, but I could hardly do it. Jordan was opposite, watching me. He could see I was shaking. I pretended to fight the wasps. I could feel his bright, bunged-up eyes on me all the time. He put his arms in a ring on the table and leaned over towards me. I was spilling the peas in my fright. I couldn't go on any longer. I lowered my spoon and looked at him. He was so hideous at close quarters, I almost threw up. The big black block of his nose reached out at me, full of wormholes, and the rest of his face looked as though it had been dragged upon with hooks. But he was smiling. "Jordan?" I said, although my tongue was like a lump of cork. "Mr. Jordan?" He nodded. "You've come back," he said. "Where have you been keeping?" The whole coffee tavern seemed to be trembling with his movements. I felt as though I was in the stifling loft of some huge pipe organ, with the din coming out full blast and all the hot woodwork in a shudder. His question had me stammering. I told him I had been busy. My business kept me moving. I travelled about a lot. The wooden building around me felt suffocating, airless as a glass house. I glanced at Danny. He looked as though he'd been tapped of all his blood and had run out. Even his yellow ears had turned chalky. Jordan nodded again, grinning his terrible grin. "The chick born in hell returns to the burning," he said. All the time he watched me from under the front of his yellow handkerchief. He ignored Danny altogether. His eyes were small, but they looked as though each one had had a good polish before being put into his head. "Our bargain was a good one," he went on, still smiling. "Very good. It turned out well." I was afraid he would hear my swallow at work. It sounded loud even above the jabbering. "I am glad," I said. I did my best. I always do my best." "My master was pleased," he said. He leaned farther forward and beckoned me towards him. I bent my head to listen, and his wooden nose was up, touching my ear. "A splendid corpse," he whispered. "Inside, a mass of corruption, tumors and malignant growths, exactly what my master needed. Cut up beautifully, it did." There was a loud sigh from Danny. When I turned to look at him, he wasn't there. He had gone down off his bench in a heap on the grass. People all round got up from their tables and crowded round. Some of them waved their arms and shouted, "Give him air," they said. "He's fainted, give him air." For a minute I forgot all about Jordan. I told the people Danny was my friend. They carried him out of the coffee tavern and laid him on the grass at the side of the road. "Loosen his neck," somebody said, and his rubber breast and collar were snatched off, showing his black combs underneath. The crowd came on like flies round jam. At last Danny opened his eyes. Someone brought him a glass of water from out of the coffee tavern. He sat up, bowed his shoulders, and put his hands over his face as though he were crying. I spotted something that I'd never noticed before. There was a big, bald hole in his red hair at the top of his head. He looked sickly, but before long he could stand up again. I pushed his breast and collar into my pocket and took him back to our lodging house. I looked round, but I couldn't see Jordan at all in the crowd. Danny was in bed for a week. He was never the same again. For one thing, he cut himself shaving, and he didn't bleed. The only thing that came out of the cut was a kind of yellow water. Before the year was out, I had buried Danny. It was wild weather, and he caught a cold standing about half naked in his tights in the fairs and markets. He took to his bed in our lodgings. Soon he was light-headed and then unconscious. Every night I sat by him in our bedroom under the roof with the candle lit, listening to his breathing. One night I dropped off to sleep in the chair, and he woke me up screaming. He dreamt Jordan was trying to chop off his hands to make him walk on the stumps. I was terrified at the noise he made. The candle went out, and the roar of the wind soaring at the roof of the house was deafening. My heart was thumping like a drum as I tried to relight the candle. I couldn't stop Danny screaming. A few minutes later, he died with a yell. Poor Danny. Being a corpse was too much for him. He never struggled out from under the paws of his memories. The next night, the man from the parish came. He asked me if I wasn't ashamed to bury my friend like that. He meant that Danny hadn't had a shave for a week. In the candlelight, he had a bright copper beard, and he wasn't quite so much like a cow. When the man had gone, I started to shave the corpse. It was hard doing it by candlelight. High up on his cheekbone, I must have done something wrong. I must have cut him, because he opened one of his eyes and looked hard at me with it. I was more careful after that. I didn't want to open the vein they say is full of lice. The morning of the funeral, I borrowed a black tie off our landlord. I bummed a wreath on strap. It was very pretty. It was a lot of white flowers on wires, made into the shape of a little armchair. In the bars of the back was a card with the word "Rest" on it, done in forget-me-nots. Danny always liked something religious like that. There was nobody in the funeral except the parson and me and 2 grave diggers. It was a bad day in autumn, very stormy. The long grass in the graveyard was lying down smooth under the flow of the wind. There were some willow trees round the wall, all blown bare, except for a few leaves sticking to the thin twigs like hair knits. The parson in his robes was a thin man, but he looked fat in the wind. As he gabbled the service, the big dried-up leaves blown along the path scratched at the gravel with webbed fingers, like cut-off hands. I wanted to run away. When Danny was in the earth, the gravediggers left. The parson and I sang a funeral hymn. The wind was roaring. As we were singing, I heard another voice joining in the distance. It was faint. I had been waiting for it. I didn't need to look round. I knew the sound of the voice and the clicking leg. They came closer and closer. Soon the voice was deafening, the sad hymn roaring like a waterfall beside me. Jordan came right up and stood between me and the parson, touching me. For shaking, he was like a giant tree hurling off the storm. His little black book was in his hand. Even in the wind I could smell the strong mouldiness that came off him, clammy as grave clay. He was bigger than ever. The brim of his black hat was spread out like a roof over my head. As he stood beside me, he seemed to be absorbing me. He put his arm with the nightstick in his hand round my shoulders. I felt as though I was gradually disappearing inside his huge body. The ground all around me melted. The path began to flow faster and faster past my feet like a rushing river. I tried to shout out in my terror. I fainted. When I came round, the parson was beside me. We were sitting on the heap of earth beside Danny's open grave. I was as wet as the bed of the river with fright. When I spoke to the parson about Jordan, he humoured me. That was a fortnight ago. Yesterday, I cut myself shaving. I didn't bleed. All that came out of the cut was a drop or two of yellow water. I wouldn't advise anybody try crossing Jordan. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Press the notification bell to be up to date with every new story. And as always, look out for the monsters.